Welcome to What Would Alan Say? A podcast discussing a variety of topics, including current events and personal or social issues, through the lens of Alan Watts' philosophy and life's work. I'm your host, Nathan, and I will be sharing some of my own opinions and analysis on these topics, and to the best of my ability, my knowledge about what Alan specifically did say, or theoretically would say, based on his own ideas, personality, and values. I highly encourage you to read, watch, and listen to Alan Watts for yourself, and discover the knowledge and wisdom he imparted during his lifetime. Visit alanwatts.org for a complete list of his books, articles, and audio or visual lectures. I sincerely hope that you will enjoy listening to this podcast, develop a curiosity for and appreciation of Alan Watts, and learn even more about the topics and ideas presented here. Since this is the very first episode of the podcast, and most of my viewers will probably be friends and family who aren't very familiar with Alan Watts, I would like to take a moment to give you a bit of background information on him, and explain the inspiration and motivation for this idea before we dive into today's topic. Alright, so here's what I would like to highlight. Alan Watts was born in Chislehurst, England in 1915. He grew up as an only child with an early interest in things such as Chinese and Japanese art and nature. He ultimately lived to be 58 years old before passing in 1973. Though Alan grew up in the tradition of the Church of England, from an early age he became interested in Buddhism. He initially identified himself as a Buddhist at the age of 17, but later in life didn't identify with any particular religion or ideological sect. Throughout his life, he developed and maintained an expansive interest in and knowledge of many other religions, as well as subjects such as linguistics, psychology, particularly psychotherapy, history and natural sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, and astronomy, especially in relation to repeating patterns in nature and human society, and obviously various philosophical traditions, particularly the contrast between Greek philosophers that influenced Western religions and cultures, and that of Chinese philosophers. He moved to New York in 1938 and became a U.S. citizen in 1943, but during most of his lifetime he lived near San Francisco. He was married 3 times and had 7 children. He studied and socialized with many scholars of Zen, and he received a master's in theology. He actually spent 5 years as a priest in the Episcopal Church. He joined and taught as a member of the faculty of the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco for 6 years, and taught at many other academic institutions. He took several trips to Japan and spent most of his time in Kyoto and the Kansai region, visiting notable temples and sacred sites in the area such as Koyasan and Heisan, which are 2 places I've actually been. And he initially became widely famous and influential because of the popularity of his unpaid weekly broadcasts for a radio station in Berkeley. So as an individual, I would describe Alan to be an incredibly free-spirited and independent thinker who was way ahead of his time, both in terms of his reasoning and personal values, as well as his success in predicting the course of many technological, social, and environmental developments and issues that we are seeing today. His main philosophical and intellectual influences are mostly related to Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and Hinduism. One of the things I'd like to emphasize in terms of his philosophy and personality is that Alan is extremely playful, lighthearted, cheeky, and joyful. Laughter and humor are frequently used to illustrate both his intellectual points and also the energy or sensory and emotional experiences to which most of his ideas are meant to point. He published many books and articles in addition to his extensive radio talks, public lectures or appearances, and some television programs. I've read several of his books, including The Watercourse Way, This Is It, Become What You Are, The Meaning of Happiness, Behold the Spirit, Cloud Hidden Whereabouts Unknown, parts of Beyond Theology, and also The Joyous Cosmology, and of course his autobiography, In My Own Way. So personally, after reading at least one of his books or several articles, I recommend that you read his autobiography if you would like to be entertained and also learn more details about his life than you can find on Wikipedia or any other website. So what's the inspiration and motivation for me doing this podcast? Well, for the past 2.5 years, Alan Watts has been a huge source of joy, of laughter, guidance, clarity, lots of positivity, and acceptance in my life. But I don't mean toxic positivity. I think that's really important to note. I'm not talking about positivity in the sense of looking at everything as though it has to be positive, or as though it's an objectively good value to have positive experiences, to feel good, to transcend suffering, and so forth. So that is not a part of Alan Watts' philosophy whatsoever. Just want to make that really clear, and I'm sure you'll understand that as we go on and discuss his ideas in depth. So, with that being said, I really want to share this with others. I want you to be entertained, and I really want you to experience a tremendous amount of joy, if possible. I also want you to experience, or at least have the tools, if you want to use them, to let go of whatever may not be serving you, and to experience a similar transformation in attitude towards whatever particular circumstances you may be facing in your own life. I recently discovered a passion for writing, and I became inspired to use many of the personal thoughts and experiences I've had, and I will continue to have even if I don't share them with you. And since I constantly think and write about Alan's philosophical methods and ideas, I figured why not just take a fresh look at some contemporary problems using what I know and have discovered. So, here we are. All right, let's dive into our first topic. This topic is going to be a 2 or more likely 3-part series about self-improvement and the self-help movement. Today we're just going to talk about self-improvement. We're not going to go into any details about specific people or ideologies or examples within the self-help movement. We're going to talk first about the conceptual framework and some of the assumptions that come with any effort or any value or any desire to improve oneself and what that entails, and basically what Alan would say about all of that and what his personal take would be on it and what he would kind of loosely speaking recommend. So, I broke this down into a few different things. I'm just gonna give you a glimpse of what we're gonna talk about here. Number 1, we've got an assumption, fallacy, and a hangup. Then number 2, we've got to talk about alienation. Number 3, we have a decision to try in spite of some of these problems, and then a warning that I have to give you, or that I have to give you on Alan Watts' behalf. And then I'm going to ask ourselves 3 questions. These are 3 questions I've come up with in the spirit of what Alan would probably ask if you are continuing to try to move towards some change or improvement. And then we've got some closing thoughts and actually some encouragement. Don't worry, lots of encouragement at the end. All right, so number one, we're thinking about self-improvement or changing something about ourselves. The first thing that Alan Watts would say about the idea of self-improvement is to point out this concept's basic assumption. So what's the assumption with self-improvement? Well, if we are to take the idea of I changing or improving me or myself, we must assume that either I, or perhaps the self, is composed of separate parts, and either I, meaning the observer and intentional, rather than habitual doer which examines myself, is a specific and separate part of a greater whole known as the self. Or that I, the observer and doer, is the greater whole, dissecting itself. So that is the assumption. That's a big mouthful, I know. That's just what I wrote out to make it very clear. So let's break that down. This assumption has to be true. Otherwise, there is a logical fallacy, because without this concept, there is no independent force of will, reason, or even physical form to be an agent of intentional or voluntary change. So what I'm saying is, there's the assumption, right? I believe that's what Alan Watts would point out, is that you either believe you are not made of separate parts, separate selves. We could use other terminologies, drives, behaviors, perhaps psychological states, separate natures. For example, like some people might believe you have a good nature and a bad nature, something to that extent. So either you don't believe that and you believe you are one whole, complete, integrated being that cannot possibly be divided, or you have to divide yourself, right? So if we divide ourselves, then we have that assumption, which is that I has to change or improve me, myself. And either the I is like a small part trying to change the bigger whole. So in other words, the observer, the sort of like conscious, rational, identifying part of yourself is maybe smaller than like a bigger whole. Or you could say, oh, well, that is the bigger whole looking inward and trying to like dissect itself and separate maybe some smaller part, some kind of particular algorithm or program, and remove it or change it, so to speak. Right? So kind of one or the other, but we run into a hangup. So how is it that someone or something that is mutually interdependent with either the original source of the flaw or maybe as a subservient part of it, how is it supposed to voluntarily enact and basically force a positive change upon itself? Like I just outlined, whether we look at it as, the small part in the bigger part or the bigger part trying to change the smaller part, this conundrum exists, and the only way we can really act is through an irrational means of disassociation. Let me say that again. Through an irrational means of disassociation. So then we have to conclude one of two things. Either there is no separate good and bad you to take sides with, and therefore nothing to improve, especially through a separated cause and effect, or you are actually full of separate selves, like we've been assuming, and you must pick a side. And whatever side you identify with is automatically the right one. I mean, you basically have to say that the side you are choosing is the good side, because otherwise we couldn't say that you want to improve or that you want to change anything. So, here's a pretty good example that illustrates what Alan Watts said about all of these points. This basic assumption we make when we try to improve ourselves, the fallacy of attempting to do so, and the hang-up it causes. Quote, human beings are largely engaged in wasting enormous amounts of psychic energy in attempting to do things that are quite impossible. You know, as the proverb says, you can't lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. But recently, I've heard a lot of references in just general reading and listening, where people say, we've got to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And you can't. And you can struggle and tug and pull until you're blue in the face, and nothing happens except that you've exhausted yourself. All sensible people therefore begin in life with two fundamental presuppositions. You are not going to improve the world, and you are not going to improve yourself. You are just what you are. And once you have accepted that situation, you have an enormous amount of energy available to do things that can be done. And everybody else looking at you from an external point of view will say, my God, how much so-and-so has improved. End quote. That's from the Veil of Thought. He goes on to say that he has many friends who are trying to improve themselves through one religion, therapy, system, or another, and, quote, I'm desperately trying to free people from this. The part of you which is supposed to improve you is exactly the same as that part of you which needs to be improved, end quote. So Alan is pretty clear on these points, but we still have several problems whether or not we decide to change ourselves. For example, let's assume we pick the second option. We've got separate parts of ourselves, and we want to remove or change or add or transform a part of ourselves. And so we pick a side and we identify with one side or many sides versus a bad side or a series of problems and so forth. So what does this lead to? This leads to our second point, which is alienation. So Alan would point out the alienation we experience by both dividing ourselves into separate parts and picking sides. That picking sides part is really important. He wouldn't say there's anything inherently wrong with dividing ourselves into separate parts. There's a few reasons for that. One is that we can't help but think and feel. So we can't help but believe and feel in a dualistic way. And to be non-dualistic about dualism, for example, we have to accept that our dualistic thinking and feeling is natural. Natural in the sense it's inevitable, it's not divisible into good and bad, right and wrong. And so we don't have to divide ourselves even further by taking another mental step back and trying to oppose the part of ourselves that has already divided ourselves. Because this leads to a never-ending loop or cycle. So the problem isn't feeling like we are separate parts. It's not believing we are separate parts. The problem is when we feel that way and then we pick sides against one part of ourselves or another. Or at least it's a problem in the sense that this is what causes alienation. And he wouldn't say that a feeling of alienation is a problem. Certainly not objectively a problem. It feels like it's a problem, but we can't say dualistically that it is or is not a problem. It's just there. So this feeling of alienation is there, and we can clumsily say it's caused by dividing ourselves and picking sides with one part or the other. So what does this look like, picking sides, dividing ourselves? Well, we have different examples. We've got like our inner psychological state, which some people divide into psychological parts, spiritual, mental parts. For example, in Jungian psychology, we could say, oh, there's your ego, there's your persona, your anima or animus, your higher self or self, and your shadow. But then we have also alienation from our environment or from other people. So basically defining ourselves or feeling as though we are separate from nature, from our like physical surroundings and environment, and from, people that we know, that we see. But there's also alienation from our body. So like mind-body dualism, looking at our body as not us, like only identifying with the part of ourselves that can look at our body. Do you see what I'm saying? The observer, believing we're just this independent observer. So we can be alienated from our body as well. And we can be alienated, like in conceptual terms, from higher and lower levels of operation. So, for example, let's take our body, right? Within our body, this concept of our body, whatever that means, we have further differentiation. Like in our bloodstream, Alan Watts talks about the example of having tons of different bacteria and various microbes. And those things are actually fighting each other, but that contributes to the overall health of our body, what we think of as an individual organism. So within us, we have examples of like these different parts of our self, so to speak, of our organism, fighting each other. And that looks like some kind of conflict, but that conflict is actually necessary for the growth and development and equilibrium and health of me, myself, and I, of what we think of as me, myself, and I. Without that, we would have some problems. Like if we chose to pick a side with some of those organisms and not others to try and like completely eradicate them, then we would become sick. So this could be looked at as like a lower level of operations. But then there's a higher level of operations too. There's obvious processes which, as human beings, we linguistically say are external to us, and we also don't think of as ourself. Whatever we see in nature, whatever we see within our solar system, what we see within the universe of galaxies interacting with each other, and like stars being born and planets being formed and all these different things, many of these processes of nature which would easily and often do kill us or destroy us. Us meaning whatever we think of as ourselves. And so even though we can look at a lower level operations and see, wow, look, there's this beautiful harmony happening in our bloodstream. What if the same is true for like a higher level of operations? We usually can't see it, or it's much more difficult for us to see. Like it's often easier to kind of look below than above, conceptually speaking. But that harmony may be there. We don't have to assume it's not. So this is another example of alienation that you might feel, is to basically feel like you only identify with this one really particular, separated out aspect of consciousness or existence. And everything within or below you and everything externally or above you is not you, and maybe it's an enemy because it feels like it is detrimental to you. It's dangerous for that tiny part that you identify with. Okay? That's alienation in a nutshell, right? Alienation meaning it's alien, it's foreign, it's spooky, perhaps, or dangerous, right? It is not you. Okay, for example, Alan Watts typically referred to and illustrated this feeling and attitude of alienation for his audience by saying, quote, "The prevalent sensation of oneself as a separate ego, enclosed in a bag of skin, is a hallucination, which accords neither with Western science nor with the experimental philosophy religions of the East." End quote. From the book On the Taboo of Knowing Who You Are. So this is what happens, which again is not to say this is good or bad, that you must change this feeling or that you must eradicate this feeling. No. We're just talking about this is a consequence, this is what happens. We look at ourselves already from a very narrow point of view, right? A very specific concept of who we are. We say, okay, I want to change who I am, or I must change who I am. So I'm going to improve myself. We then have to, if we're going to try to improve ourselves, we have to assume that we consist of separate parts, and we have to pick a side. And so we split ourselves into many parts, and we only identify with one of those parts, or maybe just a few of those parts. And then we ignore or do battle with the rest. And so what does this lead to? Alienation. So here is this feeling of alienation, right, that I've just explained. Okay, so this is where we're at. What's the third point? Well, even despite all of this, you decide or find yourself trying to improve yourself with this feeling of alienation, whether you're extremely aware of it or whether this is a more unconscious feeling that's happening as a consequence of, dividing yourself and picking sides. Okay, so you decide to improve yourself. Now I'm going to ask 3 questions if you are trying to do this. But before I ask those questions, I have to give you a warning. So this is what Alan Watts would say. This is what he says whenever we're talking about not just an effort to improve ourselves, but any technique, any method that might fall into the category of like spiritual discipline, even changing our kind of subjective feelings, even if we look at these situations and realize, oh, this isn't good or bad, it doesn't have to be this way, but maybe it's a matter of desire. Like anytime he talks about desire, he usually first presents a warning, which is going to highlight even further this hangup that I mentioned. Whenever you decide to change or improve yourself, whenever you have an intention, in other words, it's like announcing to the devil that you're done with him and you want nothing to do with him. So what does he do? He lays a trap for you. He surrounds you with greater temptations than you've ever faced. And now we've got a problem, right? And so Alan Watts' direct quote here, I was paraphrasing before, he says, if you are going to outwit the devil, it's terribly important that you don't give him any advance notice. So what does that mean? Alan Watts is basically saying you have to be spontaneous. Because as soon as you even think about improving yourself, you are setting an intention. You are manifesting a desire to change to the devil, meaning announcing to like the problem or the corruption or just the thing that needs to be changed or, eradicated, that you're going to attack it and you're going to try and remove it. And so if it has any kind of will of its own, or even simply a automatic conditioned response of self-defense, then you are alerting this part of yourself, like, I'm coming to get you, or also I'm trying to get away from you, is another way of thinking it. So here's another example. He says, it's like announcing to your creditors that you're leaving town tomorrow. So what should you do? You shouldn't announce that you're leaving town. You should just leave. Make no announcement. Conversely, if we were to say we are looking for someone or something, he quotes Chuangzi. I think it's Huangzi or Chuangzi, who's a Taoist philosopher. It's like beating a drum in search of a fugitive, end quote. So Watts uses all of these analogies to drive home a deeper point, that whether we are running from or seeking something, we are constantly trying to get one up on the universe. And the more you try to control the universe, the more you stir things up and antagonize it. Not because you and the universe are separate, but because you are in fact solidifying the already carefully constructed illusion and underlying belief that you and the universe, or more simply you and it, are separate. That last part was not a quote, that's just me summarizing his perspective in my own words. Okay, so there's the warning. So now we have like a clear example of a hang-up and a problem. Thank you very much for listening to the first part of this episode. Subscribe to my content so you can join me next time for part 2, the conclusion to our discussion of the concept of self-improvement. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support me by liking the video, sharing some feedback, and spreading the word about my website and this podcast, What Would Alan Say, with your network.